On June 15th, 1985, Erin and Josh Harlow vanished after their wedding, leaving behind only a trail of unanswered questions. The mystery of their disappearance remained unsolved for over a decade. But when a group of university students stumbled upon an eerie detail in satellite images, they unknowingly set off a chain of events that would reveal a hidden truth no one was prepared for. What they uncovered would shake everything to its core. It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. The last known image of Erin and Josh Harlow was captured on grainy VHS footage, smiling under a rain of rice as they ran hand in hand toward a gleaming new Buick Skyhawk. The crowd of family and friends cheered, unaware that they were watching a farewell, not a beginning. Erin tossed her bouquet over her shoulder. Josh opened the door for her with a theatrical bow. The car pulled away from the curb at 4:57 p.m., a just married sign taped to the back bumper, two aluminum cans dragging behind on strings. They were never seen again. If you're hearing this for the first time, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will haunt you. The day was June 15th, 1985. The wedding had taken place at a small chapel in Homestead, Florida. The couple, both 22, had grown up in the area, high school sweethearts whose story read like a Hollywood script. Prom king and queen, then college sweethearts, now newlyweds with a brand new car gifted by Josh's uncle. They were heading out for a 2-day honeymoon at a lake house in north central Florida, a modest trip given their budget, but one they'd been excited about for months. They never made it. At 7:20 p.m., Erin's mother tried calling the lake house to check if they'd arrived safely. No answer. Not unusual, she told herself. Maybe they stopped somewhere for dinner. By 10 p.m., concern turned into restlessness. By midnight, she and Josh's parents had called every relative they could think of. By 2 a.m., Erin's father was on the phone with local police. The initial investigation went nowhere. The newlyweds had driven off in broad daylight in a clearly marked vehicle. No toll booth operators remembered seeing the car. No gas stations reported serving them. No motels had them on record. Their credit cards were untouched. The car hadn't been seen on any road cameras. Not that there were many in 1985, but still no leads. The police issued a bulletin. Volunteers posted flyers. Friends from school organized a search party. Choppers were flown over nearby highways, fields, even parts of the Everglades. Divers were dispatched to canals and retention ponds. But the area was vast, wild, inhospitable, and without a concrete location, they were searching for a shadow. Rumors spread fast. Some said the couple had planned it all, staged their own disappearance to start a new life somewhere. Maybe they had debts. Maybe they got cold feet about marriage. Maybe they wanted to run from something. Others whispered darker theories. Carjacking, kidnapping, murder. But the police found no ransom note, no evidence of struggle, and no blood trail. Erin and Josh had left behind everything. Wallets, clothing, plane tickets for a later honeymoon in California, even a handwritten thank you list for their wedding guests. Nothing about it felt voluntary. By July, the case had already grown cold. By September, it was buried under new headlines. The families grieved in limbo, unable to bury or mourn. Friends stopped asking. Neighbors stopped bringing casseroles. The wedding chapel went out of business. And the billboard with their smiling faces began to fade in the sun. 1 year later, the case file was closed. No suspects, no evidence, no answers. What no one knew, not even the most persistent detective, was that the Buick never left South Florida. It hadn't crossed any highways. It hadn't passed any diners. It had veered barely a mile out of town onto a side road eaten by weeds and humidity. Then, without a sound, without an audience, it had vanished into one of the most dangerous, untraceable ecosystems in the country, the Everglades. There, beneath a shifting canopy of water, moss, and secrets, it would remain for the next 12 years. Hidden, undisturbed, forgotten, until a group of university students, working late in a computer lab on a project they barely cared about, clicked on a satellite image from June 1985 and froze. If you want to know what they saw, stay with me. The satellite image was pixelated, low resolution, and in grayscale, a digital fossil from a world before GPS, before Google Earth, before anyone imagined the past could be scanned from space. It had been captured by Landsat 5, a satellite launched in 1984 to observe Earth's surface changes. The students were part of a research team at the University of Florida, analyzing historic deforestation patterns in South Florida for a senior thesis project. It was mind-numbing work, and it wasn't supposed to involve anything but trees. Until Maya Jordan zoomed in too far and saw it. "Is that a reflection?" she asked, pointing at a thin strip of lighter pixels where the swamp met the forest edge. The cursor hovered over what looked like a metallic glint, a hard surface, unnaturally geometric, barely visible through the haze of data compression and time. Her teammate, Greg Torres, leaned in. "That's not part of the canopy. That's something else." They marked the coordinates: 25.465 degrees north, 80.688 degrees west, deep within the Everglades, on the edge of a channel no longer in use. They flipped through adjacent images from later years. The reflection never showed up again. Maya ran the coordinates through the current satellite overlay. Nothing. Just vegetation, water, and more vegetation. Whatever it was no longer visible from above. "What if it sank?" she murmured. Greg, skeptical but intrigued, flagged it to their supervising professor, Dr. Harold Kinsey, a geospatial data specialist with a penchant for old tech and missing persons cases. When they showed him the file, he leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and didn't blink for nearly a minute. "That's a car," he said. "That's not a maybe." He dug out an old news clipping from a folder he kept labeled Unresolved Anomalies. In it, a black and white photo of a smiling young couple in wedding attire stared out beneath the headline. "Still no leads in Newlyweds Disappearance." Dr. Kinsey stood up, almost reverently, and muttered, 12 years. The students didn't understand at first, but as he pulled up maps, compared timelines, and finally laid the satellite image beside the last known direction of travel from the police report, the pieces aligned. The road the couple was supposed to have taken had, at the time, been under partial construction. One detour led south, far too close to the edge of the Everglades for any standard vehicle to safely pass, especially at dusk. Within 48 hours, Kinsey filed a report with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. It didn't take long to gain traction. The Harlow's case had never been officially closed, only suspended. The file was still in the system, still accessible. The original lead detective, now long retired, was brought in as a consultant. His name was Alan Marks. He had spent years haunted by that case, kept a photo of the couple in his study, and still remembered the feeling in his gut the day he'd told their parents he had no answers. When he saw the satellite image, he only said one thing: "We were looking in the wrong direction." Recovery wouldn't be easy. The location was deep in the marshes, accessible only by airboat or helicopter. The terrain was unstable, covered in thick vegetation and full of gator nests. But the sheriff's office greenlit a recon team, and within a week, a joint task force was assembled. Environmental agents, recovery divers, law enforcement, and Dr. Kinsey's team acting as technical support. On the morning of July 9th, 1997, the task force flew over the area in a low helicopter. Dense sawgrass swayed beneath them. The water below was brown, opaque, and motionless. It looked like nothing, just wilderness. Then the pilot turned slightly west, and a hush settled over the cabin. "There," Maya whispered, pointing to a shadow beneath the surface, barely discernible, but distinctly rectangular. They hovered. The object was at least half submerged in sediment and plant overgrowth. Part of a metal bumper shimmered beneath a film of algae. The outline of a vehicle was unmistakable. A car, a full-size sedan, or what was left of one. That afternoon, divers descended in full gear. Visibility was near zero, and the water was warm, thick with decaying matter. But by touch alone, they confirmed it. The vehicle was a Buick, still locked, windows intact, license plate barely legible, 4L39VJ. The VIN number matched exactly. It was the Harlow's car. Inside, they found two skeletal remains. Seat belts still buckled, hands resting in their laps. No signs of struggle, no broken glass. Just silence. News broke within hours. Local headlines screamed, "Missing couple found after 12 years." Families were notified. The nation tuned in to the evening broadcasts. But the story wasn't over. Because when the bodies were retrieved and sent for autopsy, and when forensic analysts began to examine the remains, they found things that didn't add up. Things that couldn't be explained by time or accident. Things that suggested someone, maybe more than one someone, had wanted Erin and Josh Harlow gone, and had made sure they would never be found. The bodies were taken to the Miami-Dade medical examiner's office under tight supervision. Though little tissue remained after more than a decade underwater, the bones were remarkably intact, preserved by the swamp's anaerobic conditions, which slowed decomposition. But as Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Layla Hirsch unwrapped the remains and laid them out on parallel autopsy tables, she saw something immediately troubling. Both skulls bore fractures, not from trauma consistent with a crash, but blunt force. Clean, localized, pre-mortem. Erin's right radius, the forearm bone, had a hairline spiral fracture. Josh's ribs were cracked on the left side, 3 in a row. Their injuries told a story no one was ready to hear. These weren't caused by impact, Dr. Hirsch said during the first briefing. They were inflicted before the car ever hit water. A silence settled over the room. Could it have been a struggle inside the vehicle? The sheriff asked. No, she replied. There's no evidence of defensive wounds. No signs they tried to fight. These were controlled, targeted hits. Likely with a blunt object. The kind you swing, not the kind you hold in your hand. The car was next. After being lifted from the swamp by a flatbed team and brought to a forensic garage, it was stripped down to the frame. The exterior was badly corroded, paint long eaten away, but the structure was largely intact. No crushing of the cabin, no warping of the frame. It hadn't rolled. It hadn't crashed at high speed. But then the forensic mechanics opened the hood and froze. The brake lines had been severed, deliberately, clean cut. No corrosion on the exposed metal, indicating the damage occurred just before the submersion. The team tested the fluid reservoir. Empty. No leaks elsewhere. Someone had bled the brakes, then cut the lines completely. It was sabotage, a homicide. Erin and Josh Harlow hadn't gotten lost. They'd been led, made vulnerable, hurt, and then left to vanish in the water where no one would look. The news hit their families like a second death. Erin's younger sister, Naomi, now 30 and raising 2 kids of her own, sat silently as the sheriff read the findings in the small conference room they'd reserved for updates. Her mother, pale and shaking, whispered, "Why? Why now? Why them?" No one had answers. But the question had changed. This wasn't a cold case anymore. This was an active murder investigation. The original case files were reopened. Dozens of interviews re-examined. Every wedding guest recontacted. Old photographs reanalyzed. The car's odometer was checked. It had barely moved before the final drive. The couple had likely taken a detour within 15 minutes of leaving the reception. But why would they? The sheriff's team began mapping their last known path using 1985 road data. Back then, several side roads in southern Dade County had been opened but unpaved, remnants of agricultural grids carved into the swamp decades prior. One of those roads had led directly to a dead end near the recovery site. The theory emerged. Someone had directed them that way. Someone they trusted. The investigators dug deeper into the wedding guest list, a mix of family, friends, co-workers. One name stood out, Brandon Cole. Brandon had been Josh's co-worker at a local auto shop and had given a brief speech at the reception. He hadn't been close family, no long history, but the speech had struck some as oddly formal. He'd said things like, "Sometimes the brightest lights burn fastest, and love is beautiful and terrifying." People remembered it because it didn't feel like a toast. It felt like a eulogy. No one had heard from Brandon Cole since 1986. Detectives pulled his file. Last known address, an apartment in Kendall. Last known employer, the same auto shop where Josh had worked. But by 1987, Cole had moved out of state. No forwarding address. A background check showed a minor criminal record: trespassing, DUI, possession of stolen parts. But one detail jumped out. In early June 1985, Just 2 weeks before the Harlow's wedding, Brandon had been reprimanded at the shop. A confrontation with Josh, according to the file. Something about a stolen tools set and taking advantage. The owner wrote that tensions were high. Brandon was suspended for 3 days. No formal complaint was filed. But then came the kicker. When police located the original wedding video, now digitized for review, they rewatched the final moments as the Buick rolled away. And there, in the far left corner of the frame, partially obscured by another guest, was Brandon Cole, standing next to the passenger door, watching them leave, not smiling, not waving, just watching. Then turning away, heading toward the back of the chapel, with a parking lot connected to a gravel side road, a road that no longer exists today. Detectives issued a formal request for federal assistance. Cole's last employment record, in Arizona, under a new name, would soon uncover more than just a trail. It would open the door to a history of silence, misdirection, and a motive no one had suspected. Not love, not robbery, but something darker and far more personal. As detectives pieced together the fragmented history of Brandon Cole, the man's true identity began to unfurl like a disturbing, forgotten chapter from the past. They had already known that he'd moved to Arizona shortly after his disappearance from South Florida. What they hadn't realized was how meticulously Cole had buried himself in the shadows. His real name wasn't Brandon Cole. It was Derek Sloan. Sloan had a history, a much darker one than anyone had anticipated. The search for Sloan led to Phoenix, where investigators found him living under a different identity. He had changed his name, forged documents, and erased his past with remarkable efficiency. But his new life wasn't as clean as he'd hoped. Sloan had a criminal record, one that had somehow never been flagged when he relocated to Arizona. He had been arrested for assault in 1982, a charge he had narrowly avoided serving prison time for. His case had been dismissed, but there was a reason the courts had been lenient. He had connections. Those connections were about to come to light. When police reached out to the Arizona authorities, they were met with silence. Sloan had no official occupation, no significant ties to the community. His neighbors remembered him vaguely, a loner who kept to himself, quiet, and never engaged with the outside world. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an old police informant. The informant, who had once been in Sloan's circle of friends in Florida, reluctantly agreed to talk. He had seen the news and remembered a crucial detail from a decade earlier. Derek Sloan, it turned out, was a man with an obsessive, vengeful streak. His fixation on Josh Harlow was rooted not in some petty disagreement, but in a buried history of betrayal. Years before the wedding, Josh Harlow had been the one who introduced Sloan to Erin, but their connection hadn't been romantic. No, Erin had been the person who had convinced Josh to offer Sloan a job at the auto shop where Josh worked. At the time, Sloan was struggling to make ends meet, living out of his car, his relationships fractured, his future uncertain. He wasn't the man he had been when Josh had first hired him. The betrayal had taken root long before that. It was Erin who had first noticed Sloan's volatility. She had been the one to confront him about his behavior, the one who had gently suggested he needed help, that his anger was spiraling out of control. That moment had been the spark. The informant confirmed that Sloan had developed a dangerous obsession with Erin. It was a twisted jealousy that festered for years as he watched Josh and Erin's love flourish while he was pushed aside. When Josh and Erin announced their wedding, Sloan was nowhere near invited. But his resentment only deepened. The truth emerged when the informant revealed that Sloan had confronted Josh just weeks before the wedding, accusing him of stealing something far more precious than money, Erin's heart. But it wasn't just about Erin. It wasn't just about love. Sloan had planned to sabotage their marriage from the beginning. He'd planted himself at the wedding, quietly, unnoticed. He had been there, standing next to the car, waiting for them to leave. And when they did, he followed. The informant's voice shook as he continued. Sloan never left anything to chance. He had a plan, and it didn't matter how long it took to execute. He'd been watching them for months, tracking their every move. The car, the brake lines, it was all calculated. But what was most chilling was the final piece of the puzzle. Sloan had engineered their deaths, not in a single impulsive act, but through careful premeditation. He had sabotaged the car's brakes weeks in advance, long before the wedding day. And once Erin and Josh were on the road, it was just a matter of making sure they were on that side road, the one no one else would think to check, the one that would swallow them whole. The Everglades. The swamp had served as his final graveyard for the couple he had once admired, but had ultimately destroyed out of jealousy and a warped sense of betrayal. The new revelations were both shocking and haunting. As investigators circled back to the wedding video, they scrutinized every second of footage. When they zoomed in on Sloane's movements, they could see it now, the shift in his demeanor as he stepped away from the car, the small nod to himself as if he knew what was about to unfold. The confession came soon after. Derek Sloane was tracked down to his modest apartment in Phoenix. When the police arrived at his door, they didn't expect him to run. Instead, Sloane opened the door slowly, calmly, and faced the officers. His eyes were cold, distant. There was no regret, no remorse, just an eerie calm. The moment they read him his rights, Sloane gave a single sentence. "I had to make sure they never made it," he said, as if explaining a simple, logical course of action. The arrest didn't bring closure. It didn't erase the fear that gripped the Harlow families. There would be no coming back from the betrayal, no returning to the normalcy they had once known. But what it did bring was truth. The truth behind the mystery that had haunted South Florida for 12 long years. It turned out that the Everglades held more than just water and mud. It held secrets that only needed the right person to uncover. The truth would never bring Erin and Josh back, but it would finally give their families the peace they had been denied for so long. But as the investigation came to a close, a chilling thought lingered in the air. If Sloane was willing to do this to Josh and Erin, who else had he set his sights on? Derek Sloane's arrest was a media frenzy, but it was the aftermath that disturbed the public more than the crime itself. As his trial began to take shape, layers of his motives and actions were peeled away one by one, revealing a man not just consumed by jealousy, but driven by something darker, more methodical, something that went beyond obsession. The defense tried to paint Sloane as a man struggling with personal demons, claiming his actions were the result of a psychotic break brought on by years of rejection and emotional trauma. But as more details from his past emerged, it became clear that his plan to destroy Josh and Erin was not one made in haste. It was a premeditated act of vengeance, born from years of festering hatred. The prosecution presented evidence from his previous arrests, the one for assault, the violent outbursts, the numerous complaints about his unpredictable behavior. But what really sealed Sloane's fate were the cold, calculated details of his plan. How he'd sabotaged the Harlow's car, how he'd stalked their every move leading up to the wedding, how he'd waited for the perfect moment to strike. Still, it was the wedding video that stuck in everyone's minds. That one moment when Sloane stood by the car, watching as the newlyweds made their escape. It was chilling to think that, all along, the man who appeared to be a mere wedding guest had been the orchestrator of a tragedy. Yet even as the evidence mounted, Sloane remained eerily silent in court, offering no remorse, no apology. His only statement was a repeated, cold confession. They were too happy, too perfect, and I couldn't let them be. The trial ended swiftly. A guilty verdict was handed down in a matter of hours, and Sloane was sentenced to life without parole. But for those who had been affected by his actions, the sentence didn't feel like justice. It was simply the end of a chapter that had dragged on for far too long. Erin's family, especially her mother, struggled with the finality of it all. 12 years had passed since her daughter had disappeared, and now they had the truth, but it didn't feel like closure. It felt like another loss. Josh's parents, too, were left with an aching emptiness. The reality that their son had been the victim of such a calculated act of malice was something they hadn't been able to prepare for. The man who had once been a son-in-law to them had become an object of pity, and now the man who had betrayed their trust and stolen their son's future would live out his days behind bars. The anger was palpable, but it couldn't replace the son they had lost. But not everyone shared this sense of finality. The haunting thought that Sloane had orchestrated this act of murder so methodically left many with questions that couldn't be answered. What was the real motivation behind it all? Why Erin and Josh? They weren't the only couple Sloan had known. They weren't the only people he'd been close to. His jealousy wasn't just a product of their happiness. It was a reflection of his own inability to accept rejection. Erin had seen his brokenness, his struggle, and had offered him kindness. Yet, in his twisted mind, even that gesture was something to be resented. He saw her as a prize, not a person. But there was another, far more sinister element to his plan that hadn't come to light in the trial. As the months passed after Sloan's conviction, a former friend of his from Florida, who had been part of his inner circle back in the mid-1980s, came forward with a chilling detail, something that had gone unnoticed until now. Sloan had made several attempts to sabotage other lives before Erin and Josh. His obsession with Erin wasn't born out of sudden, irrational infatuation. It was a long-running pattern. There had been two other women before Erin. Two other young women he had worked with, befriended, and eventually alienated. Each had noticed something strange about Sloan, a possessiveness, a need to control. Each had grown wary of him, eventually severing ties, just as Erin had. One of those women, a former co-worker of Erin's, came forward after hearing the news. Her name was Lisa Green, and she had worked with Sloan at a local gas station back in 1983. Lisa had dated Sloan briefly, but the relationship ended quickly when she started noticing his manipulative behavior. He would show up uninvited, call her incessantly, and become furious if she didn't respond the way he wanted. When she broke things off, he threatened her, and Lisa left Florida soon after. As Lisa spoke with investigators, it became clear that Sloan's obsession wasn't a one-time aberration. It was a pattern, a cycle of emotional control and violence that he had woven into the fabric of his relationships with women. Erin had been the most recent victim of that cycle. His jealousy and rage had built up over the years, and by the time he saw Josh and Erin's wedding, it had been too much for him to bear. The breaking point wasn't just their marriage. It was Erin's empathy, her kindness, qualities that made her so desirable to him, but that he could never possess. The chilling realization hit the investigators. Sloan's need for control had driven him to destroy everything that represented what he could never have. The story of Erin and Josh Harlow, once a tale of love and promise, had become an enduring symbol of the destructive power of obsession and jealousy. For those who had loved them, there would never be a resolution, only a harsh, jagged edge of truth that cut deeper than the loss itself. As for Sloan, the future was bleak. His life sentence in prison would be one of isolation, regret, and the slow unraveling of a man who had once believed he could control everything, even life itself. But as the years went on, some wondered, what other lives had he ruined, quietly in the shadows? How many more stories had Sloan tried to erase, just as he had done to Erin and Josh? The discovery of Derek Sloan's pattern of obsession and manipulation left more than just a bitter aftertaste. It left investigators with a haunting question. How many more lives had he touched, or destroyed, in his twisted journey of jealousy and control? For the families of Erin and Josh Harlow, the investigation felt like a pendulum swinging between fleeting moments of clarity and the heavy weight of uncertainty. With each new revelation, a deeper shadow was cast over Sloan's years of existence. But for those who knew him, the true horror wasn't just the murder of two innocent people. It was the sheer, quiet persistence of Sloan's insidious influence, a force so unnoticed, so invisible, that it almost seemed unreal. As the years went by, many people, both inside and outside of law enforcement, began to dig into Sloan's past, examining his movements, his relationships, his motives. Some thought they'd uncovered every dark corner of his history, but there was still one piece left. One question that hadn't been answered. Why, after all these years, had Sloan's jealousy remained dormant? Why had he waited until Erin and Josh's wedding to finally act? The answer lay in the twisted psychology of Derek Sloan. Sloan's life, as it turned out, was riddled with an inability to let go of past relationships, particularly his first and most profound one, his relationship with his mother. It had never come up during the trial, But Sloane's history with his mother was one of abandonment and emotional manipulation. She had left him when he was young, chasing her own dreams and leaving Derek in the hands of distant relatives. As an adult, Sloane resented her for it. He resented her for abandoning him and leaving him to fend for himself. There were no more obvious targets in Sloane's life than the women who reminded him of his mother. Women like Erin, who showed kindness but whose love and attention he could never fully possess. It was this childhood trauma that slowly, methodically, led to the terrible act of violence against Erin and Josh. The carefully cultivated hatred for women who left him, who didn't need him, had taken root in his mind long before he ever met Erin. In fact, she had unwittingly become the culmination of everything he couldn't have, everything he felt he was denied. But this wasn't the end of the story. As the years passed, Sloane's name began to surface again, not in the context of his past relationships or the murders, but in connection with something far stranger and ultimately more terrifying. A new group of researchers, this time focusing on missing persons in South Florida, had begun looking into cases dating back to the early 80s, analyzing patterns of disappearances along certain highways and isolated roads. They noticed a disturbing trend. Several young couples, mostly in their early 20s, had disappeared around the same time, often on the same unpaved back roads near the Everglades. The police had written them off as simply cold cases, but the researchers started to notice something that no one had caught on before. In the case of the Harlows, there had been a clear sign that they were targeted. Sloane's obsession with them was well documented, his history of violence and control revealed at trial. But the researchers found something else that was harder to dismiss. Sloane's name didn't just appear in their records once. It appeared over and over again, like a shadow lingering in the background of almost every disappearance. At first, it seemed like coincidence, but as they dug deeper, they found something chilling. Sloane's interactions with these couples, as strange as it sounded, were disturbingly consistent. Each pair had encountered him on the same back roads. They had been in the same vicinity before vanishing. And even more disturbingly, Sloane had been either a co-worker, a friend, or a loose acquaintance of each person involved. At least 3 other couples from the same era had disappeared within miles of the Harlow case, but they had vanished in ways that didn't fit the mold. These weren't the high-profile disappearances of famous cases. These were quiet tragedies, overlooked by the media and largely forgotten by law enforcement. However, new evidence began to surface, leading to a terrifying conclusion. Derek Sloane had been operating as a ghost. No one had ever suspected him as a part of these other disappearances. Why? Because no one had ever connected the dots. He wasn't an obvious suspect. He hadn't made any major moves that would raise red flags. He hadn't been caught in the act of violence. But he had been in the background of these other tragedies, planting seeds of emotional torment, manipulating and controlling until the relationships fell apart, or until he decided to destroy them entirely. The final piece of this puzzle came when a private investigator named Olivia Reese, hired by the parents of a young couple that had vanished in 1982, uncovered a photograph in an old record book. It was a shot from a small party that had been held just before the disappearance. In the corner of the photo, half obscured by a crowd, stood Sloane, looking calm, even pleased with himself. But what made the photo so disturbing was the small detail that no one had noticed before. There in the background was a car, a Buick, a model just like the one Sloane had used in the Harlow case. It was a devastating realization. Sloane had been systematically targeting couples for years, watching from the sidelines, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy their love. The Harlows had been just another in a long line of victims, a pair that, for whatever reason, had attracted the full force of his rage. For those who had loved Erin and Josh, the new revelations didn't bring closure. It simply brought more questions. Had they been the only ones? How many others had fallen victim to Sloane's obsession? What other lives had he ruined, quietly, without ever being noticed? The pain of their deaths, of the betrayals that led to their demise, would never fade. But as new investigations reopened old cases, it became clear Sloane's reach had been longer than anyone had ever imagined. And it still haunted them, a ghost in the darkness of the Everglades. As the investigation into Derek Sloan's long history of targeting couples continued, the unsettling truth began to sink in. There were more victims than anyone had originally suspected. And as more evidence came to light, a disturbing pattern emerged that was even more horrifying than the acts of violence themselves. The families of Erin and Josh Harlow had been convinced that their children's deaths were isolated, the result of one man's twisted jealousy and rage. But as more missing persons cases were reopened, they realized something far more chilling. Erin and Josh were just the latest in a series of tragedies that spanned more than a decade. The quiet, controlled way in which Sloan had destroyed lives became a key part of the investigation. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways no one could have predicted. With each revelation, it became clear that his pattern of behavior was disturbingly systematic. It wasn't just about jealousy. It wasn't just about the women he couldn't have. It was a deeper, darker need, the need to control. Sloan's emotional and psychological manipulation was part of a larger, twisted blueprint, one that saw him insert himself into couples' lives, gain their trust, and then destroy their love when he felt they were too happy. His manipulation was subtle but insidious. He didn't force people into submission. He made them come to him, all the while convincing them they were in control. The investigators began tracking his movements over the years, piecing together the names of those who had crossed paths with Sloan during the years before Erin and Josh's disappearance. His name had been linked to various odd events, people in his life, all of whom had seen his twisted obsession firsthand, but had never connected the dots. One such individual was Claudia Winters, a woman who had worked as a waitress in a small cafe in Homestead, Florida, during the early 1980s. She had briefly dated Sloan before Erin entered the picture, and the memories she held of that time were disturbing. Derek always had a way of drawing you in, Claudia recalled in an interview with investigators. He could charm you into thinking he was just another guy, but there was always something behind those eyes. Something off. She went on to describe a pattern of Sloan's behavior. How he'd initially seemed loving and attentive, only to later become possessive and unpredictable. He would turn up at her apartment unannounced, make unreasonable demands, and manipulate her emotions. When she ended the relationship, Sloan's anger became all-consuming. It was clear now that the same possessiveness that had driven his relationship with Claudia was the same jealousy that had fueled his obsession with Erin. "I thought I was the only one who'd ever left him," she said, her voice trembling. "But when I heard about Erin and everything that happened to her, I just knew he had been doing the same thing with her. He didn't know how to let go." For the families of the Harlows, hearing stories like Claudia's was gut-wrenching. The knowledge that their daughter's death had been part of a much larger pattern only deepened their grief. But as the investigation continued, they came to understand something even darker. Sloan's actions weren't isolated incidents. He was methodical, he was patient, and he was not finished. The Harlow family had never suspected Sloan's involvement in their children's lives, let alone in their deaths. They had assumed that their son-in-law had been an innocent bystander, a victim of some random act of violence. But now, after hearing testimonies like Claudia's, it became painfully clear that Sloan had been working on his plan for years. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Sloan's efforts had been calculated to the point of near perfection. He had been careful to erase any trace of himself from the records, to keep his identity hidden, to manipulate those around him, and to distance himself from suspicion. He didn't act rashly. He waited, he planned, and when the time was right, he struck. Detective Alan Marks, who had led the initial investigation into the Harlow's disappearance, sat at his desk one night, poring over the new evidence. He found himself haunted by a growing realization. This wasn't just a story about one disturbed man. It was a story about how the system had failed to catch him. Over the years, Sloan had slipped through the cracks. His crimes were buried beneath the weight of other investigations. His manipulations had been dismissed as nothing more than petty jealousy or love gone wrong. But it was more than that. It was the slow, insidious erosion of lives that had been right in front of them, families that had suffered and never known why. "I missed it," Marks muttered to himself. We all missed it. The breakthrough came when one of Sloane's former co-workers, a man named Mark Thompson, came forward. Mark had been a close friend of Josh Harlow at the auto shop where the two had worked together before the wedding. He admitted that he'd always had a bad feeling about Sloane, how the man seemed to hover over Erin and Josh, watching them when they weren't looking. He used to say things, offhand comments, about Josh, about how Erin was too good for him. He always acted like he knew something we didn't. Mark confessed, visibly shaken. But none of us took him seriously. We thought he was just weird. Mark's testimony confirmed a new theory. Sloane had been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to destroy the couple's happiness. His obsession with Erin, with their love, had been the final trigger. As the case continued to unfold, it became clear that the true tragedy wasn't just the loss of Erin and Josh. It was the sheer number of people Sloane had manipulated, hurt, and alienated over the years. Every person who had been a part of his orbit, whether briefly or long-term, had been damaged in some way. The investigation had opened up a Pandora's box, revealing not only the twisted mind of Derek Sloane, but the ripple effect of his actions, touching countless lives. For the Harlow family, the pain of their daughter's death would never fade, but they had found something else through this process, a truth that had been hidden, suffocating for too long. And though justice had been served, it was impossible to ignore the thought that lingered in the air, unanswered. What if Sloane wasn't the only one? The revelations about Derek Sloane's long history of manipulation and violence had not only shattered the Harlow family's sense of closure, but they also reopened wounds in the community that had been long buried. The fact that Sloane had operated unnoticed for over a decade, systematically ruining the lives of those who came into his orbit, left many wondering, how many more like him are out there? Detective Alan Marks, having spent countless hours poring over Sloane's past, began to connect disturbing dots between Sloane's seemingly unrelated actions and other disappearances in Florida. With Sloane's arrest and conviction, the case should have been closed, but something gnawed at Marks. The more he looked into it, the more he began to wonder if Sloane was merely the tip of the iceberg, a larger, more insidious pattern that no one had yet recognized. There were whispers, rumors, murmurs of other people, other cases where things hadn't quite added up. The patterns of manipulation, of obsessive jealousy, and calculated cruelty that Sloane had woven through his life didn't seem isolated anymore. They seemed like part of a disturbing, larger movement that few could even begin to comprehend. As he sat in his office one late evening, staring at the open case files in front of him, Marks found himself grappling with the haunting question. Had they truly caught the man responsible for Erin and Josh's deaths? Or was he just one cog in a much larger machine? In the weeks following Sloane's conviction, Marks requested access to several cold cases in the area, particularly those from the early 1980s to the early 1990s. He pulled up records of unsolved disappearances and deaths in South Florida that bore more than a passing resemblance to the Harlow case. Young couples, isolated in remote areas, with no clear explanation for their disappearances. Most of these cases had been closed, written off as lost causes. Yet the more Marks looked, the more he found that there were links between these cases, subtle ones, at first glance. Names, places, and dates began to overlap. He turned his attention to an old case from 1990, Sarah and Mike Wheeler, a young couple who had disappeared without a trace while on a road trip near the Everglades. They had been headed for a camping trip, and their car had been found abandoned miles from any marked trail. Sarah and Mike's case had gone cold after only a few months of searching. The police had assumed that the couple had gotten lost, but no one had ever found evidence to support that theory. Their bodies had never been recovered. What struck Marks as odd was the mention of a small, off-the-beaten-path gas station where Mike Wheeler had stopped just a few hours before their disappearance. The clerk had vaguely remembered the couple, but only after being prompted by the authorities. The clerk mentioned a man who had seemed too interested in Sarah as they paid for gas. He had lingered at the counter, staring at them. The description was chillingly familiar. It was a description of Derek Sloane. Marks's blood ran cold. Sarah and Mike had been the first of many couples to disappear, Sloane's earliest victims, before he had honed his method. He had been targeting couples for years, quietly, calculatingly, manipulating them from the sidelines. In a desperate attempt to tie together the cases, Marks reached out to the families of the missing, and the response was overwhelming. More than one mother had spoken about a strange man who had lingered around the periphery of their children's lives. A man who had seemed too interested, too invested in their relationships. But no one had ever suspected him. No one had ever thought to look at Sloan. The evidence was starting to mount in front of Marks's eyes, like a slow-moving avalanche. But it wasn't just the police files that were pointing towards Sloan's involvement in other disappearances. One name kept cropping up again and again: Ellen Duvall. Ellen Duvall had disappeared in 1984, just 1 year before Erin and Josh's wedding. She had been a college student who had been last seen on a camping trip with her boyfriend. Her body was never found, and after a few months, the case was shelved. But her disappearance had left a hole in her family's heart, and her parents had never stopped looking for answers. Ellen's story seemed eerily similar to that of Sarah and Mike Wheeler, young lovers heading out on an adventure, only to vanish without a trace. But this time, there was a difference. Ellen's family had never been quite satisfied with the police's conclusions. They had always felt that there was more to the story. What struck Marks was a piece of information that had never been fully examined. Ellen Duvall had been dating a man named Derek Sloan before she disappeared. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Marks returned to Sloan's prison cell, demanding to speak with him. He knew that Sloan had already confessed to the Harlow murders, but something inside Marks told him that Sloan wasn't finished with his silence yet. When he arrived, Sloan was sitting silently in his cell, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Marks sat down across from him, trying not to show how much he felt the weight of the truth settling in. "Derek, it's time to talk," Marks said softly. Sloan's eyes flickered for just a moment, but he didn't speak. "I know about Ellen Duvall. I know you were with her before she disappeared. And I know you were involved in at least 3 other disappearances." Sloan's lips curled into a tight smile. "You don't know anything, detective." Marks leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You've been hiding in plain sight for years, Derek. But not anymore. I know what you did." There was a long pause before Sloan finally spoke. "I never meant for it to end this way," he muttered, almost as if he were speaking to himself. But before Marks could ask any further questions, the guards called for the end of the visitation. Sloan was moved back into his cell, leaving Marks with one final thought. This wasn't over. The truth was beginning to settle in, but it was far from complete. Derek Sloan had confessed, but his confession was laced with cryptic half-truths, as though he was playing some twisted game, trying to keep his cards close to his chest. Detective Alan Marks, despite all the new information, could feel the dark weight of something unfinished hanging over him. Sloan had admitted to the murders, but he hadn't revealed all of the details. He was holding something back, and Marks knew that this mystery wasn't over. Sloan had orchestrated too many disappearances, ruined too many lives for there to be no final piece to the puzzle. The question lingered in the air. What drove him to this? Was it just jealousy? Or was there something deeper, more insidious behind his years of manipulation? Mark spent the following weeks relentlessly reviewing the files, combing through the details of Sloan's past, retracing the steps of the couples who had gone missing. But the further he delved into Sloan's life, the more he realized that the murders were just the tip of a much darker iceberg. Sloan had been a shadow behind countless relationships, a ghost manipulating everything in the background, destroying everything he couldn't control. Then came the breakthrough. It wasn't just that Sloan had been obsessed with his past relationships, or that he tried to control every woman he had ever been with. It was the fact that he had always been obsessed with control itself. Marks discovered that Sloan had been involved in something far more disturbing, a cult-like group in the 1980s that thrived on secrecy and manipulation. It wasn't a well-known organization, but it had been responsible for attracting individuals like Sloan, individuals who wanted to be seen as important, to be in control, to dominate and manipulate those around them. The group called themselves the Watchers. The Watchers weren't a traditional cult in the religious sense. They didn't worship any deity or idol. Their focus was purely on psychological dominance. They were a collective of individuals who believed that the world was a chessboard, and the only way to win was to control the pieces. It was about gaining power over people, manipulating emotions, thoughts, and even relationships. To the watchers, people were pawns, and the most valuable thing in life was being the one who controlled the game. Sloan had joined the group in the early 1980s, just before Erin and Josh's wedding. He had been a low-level participant at first, listening to the teachings and trying to gain influence over others. But as time went on, Sloan rose through the ranks. His skills at manipulating those around him became more refined, more calculated. The watchers taught him how to exploit insecurities, how to sow doubt, and how to control the people in his life without them ever realizing they were being manipulated. What was even more terrifying was the fact that Erin and Josh hadn't been the only targets of Sloan's control. In fact, he had used the Watcher's teachings to set his sights on every couple he had ever been involved with. Each relationship was a game, a challenge to see how much influence he could exert over his partner, how much he could control without them realizing it. When they broke free, when they showed resistance, Sloan went further, using the tools he had learned from the Watchers to destroy them. Marks found proof that Sloan had kept journals, private, hidden notes detailing his manipulation of Erin, of Josh, of each person he had ever been involved with. These journals were chilling to read. They weren't just accounts of his actions. They were records of his twisted philosophy on life. Sloan had seen every person he manipulated as part of the game. There were no boundaries, no morality, only the thrill of controlling another person's fate. The truth hit Marks like a freight train. This wasn't just about Sloan's jealousy. This wasn't just about Erin and Josh's marriage. It was about power. Sloan had spent years weaving a web of control and destruction, and Erin and Josh had become his ultimate victims. They had been the perfect couple, with everything he couldn't have. And because of that, they had to be eliminated. But the most terrifying revelation was that Sloan hadn't acted alone. The Watchers had enabled him. They had shown him how to manipulate, how to control, how to ruin lives. Sloan was the one who had executed the plan, but he had been trained, guided, and empowered by the teachings of a shadowy group that operated just beneath the surface of society. Marks found himself at a crossroads. The arrest of Derek Sloan had been a victory, yes, but it had also opened a Pandora's box. What had begun as a simple murder investigation had now expanded into something far more sinister. Marks couldn't just walk away from the case. He couldn't stop at Sloan's conviction. The Watchers were still out there, operating in the shadows, shaping lives, controlling people. The members of the group had slipped through the cracks for years, and Sloan had been the proof that they could remain hidden for as long as they wanted. And then, something else hit him. Sloan had spent years controlling and destroying couples. But had he truly stopped? Or had he just perfected his methods, moving deeper underground? The investigation had exposed one man's twisted journey. But the more Marks uncovered, the more it became clear that the game was far from over. Sloan had been just one piece of the puzzle, and the most chilling part of it all was this. If Sloan had been working with the Watchers, who else had he influenced? Who else had he manipulated? Marks had a choice to make. He could walk away, satisfied that justice had been served in the case of Erin and Josh. Or he could dig deeper, expose the Watchers, and risk everything to stop a group that had been operating in the shadows for decades. There was no easy answer, but one thing was certain. The truth was only the beginning. Detective Alan Marks had never been one to leave a case unfinished. But as the investigation into Derek Sloan's ties to the Watchers unfolded, the magnitude of the situation became overwhelming. The more Marks uncovered, the more he realized that he wasn't just chasing a criminal. He was chasing a shadow network that had operated undetected for decades, weaving its influence across countless lives. Marks reached out to federal agencies, hoping to leverage their resources to take down the Watchers. What he didn't expect was the pushback. Officials, hesitant to jump into an investigation that had no clear structure or leads, began to question whether it was worth the effort. After all, Sloan had been caught, and the Harlow case was technically solved. What more was there to pursue? But Marks knew better. This wasn't just about a few ruined lives. It was about an unseen force that had been manipulating society from the shadows, creating chaos and destruction without anyone knowing. If they didn't stop it now, the group could spread, infecting more lives, more relationships. With no backup from the higher-ups, Marks took matters into his own hands. He began to secretly investigate the Watchers. As he dug deeper into their history, he uncovered something terrifying. The Watchers weren't just a handful of individuals. They were a network with tentacles that reached into nearly every corner of society. They had infiltrated organizations, businesses, even law enforcement. They thrived on secrecy and control, quietly pulling strings in the background. Mark spent sleepless nights going through old records, cross-referencing names, dates, and events. The more he searched, the clearer it became that the Watchers' reach was far wider than anyone had imagined. They had been shaping events for years, using their influence to sway decisions, destroy careers, and manipulate relationships. But what shocked Marks the most was the discovery of a disturbing list of names. High-profile figures, all tied to the Watchers. It wasn't just the ordinary criminals, the small-time offenders who fell into the group's web. No, the Watchers had connected themselves to people with power, people who could make things happen. Businessmen, politicians, and even celebrities. The organization was everywhere. One name stood out above the rest: Caleb Harris, a well-known philanthropist and influential business tycoon in Florida. Harris had been a prominent figure in the local community for decades. On the surface, he was beloved, respected, and admired for his charitable work. But Marks discovered that Harris had been tied to the Watchers for over 20 years. He was one of the group's primary financiers, using his wealth and influence to protect them from scrutiny and provide them with the resources they needed to continue their work. Marks was stunned. The idea that someone like Harris, a man with so much power and control, could be involved in such a dangerous, manipulative organization sent a chill down his spine. If someone like Harris was a part of the Watchers, how many others were there, hidden in plain sight? The discovery marked a turning point in the investigation. It was no longer about stopping a single man, Sloan. It was about dismantling an entire underground network that had been wreaking havoc on society for decades. But it was also a dangerous game. Caleb Harris had immense resources and connections. Going after him, or anyone else tied to the Watchers, would put Marks and anyone involved at serious risk. Undeterred, Marks pushed forward, reaching out to former members of the Watchers who had broken away or been expelled. Slowly, he gathered information, pieces of the puzzle that helped him understand the full scope of the organization. They had learned from their mistakes, covering their tracks even more meticulously than before. But Marks had the edge, the sheer persistence and determination that had led him to Sloan. The breakthrough came when Marks tracked down Marissa Green, a former high-ranking member of the Watchers who had fled the organization years ago. She had gone underground, fearing for her life, but Marks was able to find her in a small town in Georgia. She was wary at first, reluctant to speak out about her past, but after hours of persuasion, she began to open up. Marissa had been with the Watchers since the early 80s. She had helped recruit members, facilitated their operations, and had been one of the group's most trusted individuals. But over time, she had become disillusioned with their methods, the constant manipulation, and the destruction they left in their wake. She had left when she realized how far they were willing to go to maintain control. They believed they could reshape society, Marissa explained, her voice shaking with fear and regret. They didn't just want power, they wanted absolute power over everyone, over families, over businesses, over entire communities. They thought they could control everything. When Marks asked why they had chosen to target young couples, she explained it in chilling terms. They thought love was the most powerful force in the world. And if they could control love, they could control everything. That's why they went after couples like Josh and Erin. They saw their love as something fragile, something to destroy. The more Marks spoke with Marissa, the more he realized that the Watchers were not just a criminal group. They were a philosophy, a movement. And it wasn't just about destroying couples or individuals. It was about reshaping society, eroding trust, and creating a world where control was the ultimate currency. Marissa's final words were a warning. Don't think Sloan was the only one. There are others out there, still pulling the strings, still watching. With that knowledge, Marks knew his work was far from over. Sloane's conviction had been a victory, but the war against the Watchers was just beginning. He had opened Pandora's box, and there was no going back. As the years passed, Marks continued to work in the shadows, digging deeper, exposing more of the network that had so carefully hidden itself from the world. He would never rest until the Watchers were dismantled piece by piece, until their grip on society was finally broken. For the families of Erin and Josh, the truth had been the beginning of a long, painful journey. But as the investigation continued, one thing became certain. The fight for justice was far from over. And in the end, it wasn't just about exposing Derek Sloan. It was about dismantling the dangerous network that had poisoned countless lives. And that fight, the fight against control, against manipulation, against everything Sloan and his cohort stood for, would be the true battle.